Great.
Hello, everyone. Today I am with Mark Winborn, Ph.D., and Mark is a Jungian psychoanalyst and a clinical psychologist. He's a training analyst with the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts, the C.G. Jung Institute, Küsnacht. He's published and edited 5 books, including Deep Blues, Human Soundscapes for the Archetypal Journey, and Jungian Psychoanalysis, a Contemporary Introduction, part of the Routledge series. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Mark, we're going to be talking about Jung and the metaphorical mind, but I wondered whether we could maybe start just with some of your story and the turning points and maybe some of the main influences and how you got into Jung, and if we could just start from there.
Okay. Yeah, I came out of high school not really knowing what I wanted to do at all, and enrolled in university, but had no idea what I was going to study. And so I initially enrolled in general business administration and never took a single class in that subject. And was pretty directionless through the first year, and happened to stumble through the Reserve Officers Training Corps building, cutting through it to go to a class one day, and somebody asked me, "Are you interested? Or do you want to know something about this was for the Army Reserve Officers Training in the university." And so I said, sure, and it sounded exciting, and I quickly took to it and loved it, and became involved with that. And out of that, somebody advised me to take criminal justice. And I thought, that sounds interesting. And I started taking that for the first 3 years. And then there was something that happened with that I could do very well in that subject with, and I could maintain a very high grade point with only going to the classes or with only doing the reading. And there was something that was somehow fundamentally ethically wrong with that in my mind. And I went into a pretty serious depression. A lot of people became concerned about me. And somehow I had an intuition that it was about this emptiness of this being able to excel academically without actually putting in that much effort. And I decided in my young mind that I needed to switch majors. And my father was a psychology professor. And so naturally, I didn't want to become a psychologist.
That's
And
probably why you were staying away from that.
right, right. But psychology was literally the only major in the university that I could transfer into and still graduate on time. This was midway through my third year. And because I needed to be able to transfer a lot of the criminal justice credits as electives in the psychology department. They were both in the College of Social Sciences. And so I had to graduate on time because had a contract with the military to provide for they were paying for my education. And I quickly fell in love with psychology, to my amazement, and did well but found something in that. And the Army amazingly let me have a 4-year educational delay to pursue my Ph.D. I got into 4 programs and selected the University of Memphis, their clinical psychology program, primarily for financial reasons. They provided they didn't provide a full ride, but they provided a substantial amount of financial aid. And so I was actually a commissioned officer in the Army while I was pursuing my PhD. And then because I was an Army officer, I did my clinical psychology internship year in the Army at a really wonderful site called William Beaumont Army Medical Center in El Paso, Texas. where it was one of the most supportive, individuating institutions I've ever been in. I mean, they on day one, they said, what do you want to be as a psychologist? And then they said, don't panic. If you don't know the answer to that, we want you to find the answer to that by the time you leave here a year from now.
That's great.
And they said, we will do whatever you think would be beneficial to that search, as if we can do it, if it's within our power.
You lucked in.
I did. I lucked in. And then I got one of the guys who was doing a reading group for us that nobody else was really interested in, but I was fascinated by it. It wasn't a psychology reading group. He wanted us to bring in books that were important to us and talk about why they were important. And so he was also sharing what was important to him, and one of the books that was important to him was Memories, Dreams, Reflections. He was a psychologist who was a recovering alcoholic. And Bill W's connection to Jung was a part of his process. And I asked if, technically, as an active duty military officer, I'm supposed to be treated, if I need treatment, by somebody on active duty. This guy was a civilian. He was a former Army psychologist. And I asked, can I go into therapy with Rich? Will you pay for it? And they said, yeah, we will. We will work it out. And they did. And that was my first therapy experience in life at like 27 years old.
So he had been strongly influenced by Jung, would you say? Or?
Yeah. He wasn't formally trained, but he had done he was a clinical psychologist who had done a lot of reading in Jung.
Mm.
And so I went into therapy with him. And then we have to select possible sites for our first duty position after we finish our internship year. And I selected as my top choice the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, north of New York City.
Mm.
And I was selected for that slot, and I became the staff psychologist for the mental health center at the university there at West Point. And so then I was for 3 years stationed 45 minutes north on the Hudson River, 45 minutes north of New York City. And I was able to enroll in some professional programs at the New York Jung Institute. And then eventually a program that was run by Don Kalshed called the Professional Enrichment Program in Analytical Psychology. That was a 1-year program, and then you could sort of re-up to take additional years. And so I went to that for a year, and then it was time for me to discharge from the Army. And I decided to go back to Memphis because I had connections there and could open up a private practice and have referral sources and things like that. And luckily, Memphis has a seminar of the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts there. We actually train in 8 different cities, and Memphis was one of those cities. Yep. So I could have my practice. I could train in the same city I was living in. It was great.
And did it have anything to do with your love of the blues? That choice to go to Memphis? I know you're saying you went there for academic reasons, but I'm wondering.
Well, it certainly didn't hurt that I was already interested in the blues. I probably wouldn't move to a city at that time just based on the kind of music, but it certainly was a big part of it. And at that time, there were the industry's kind of changed a bit, but at that time, I could see all sorts of prominent blues acts coming through town, like John Lee Hooker and B.B. King, and Albert King lived there. I would see him just out in informal settings all of the time. I saw so many acts during the time I was in graduate school. It was like a feast. And it was still pretty much that way when I returned. So I left Memphis in 1986 to go on internship and returned in 1990 to open my private practice and enter analytic training.
I was saying when we were talking about doing this podcast, when we were first talking, that one of the things I appreciate about you is you know, obviously your educational trajectory. It's like you've got the left brain stuff,
Uh-huh.
but you often, to me, it seems like you often take up right brain kind of topics in psychotherapy in terms of metaphor, emotions,
Hmm.
the whispers out on the edge of, the therapy session or whatever. So
Right.
it's kind of like you're shining a light on some of those more right-brained areas
Right.
and even through brain science or whatever. So maybe we can get onto that in a while. But
Yeah, I also do some writing. I've got a paper that's coming out in Journal of Analytical Psychology next year called Finding the Poetic Voice in Analysis. So I'm very interested in poetry as well. And of course, poetry has a strong affinity with or connection with songwriting, which I'm
yeah,
also interested in. Uh, yeah.
yeah,
So I'm
poetry,
also
music, metaphor.
yeah. Yeah, so I'm also a performing musician and have been in a variety of different settings over the years. Sometimes I'm too busy to perform, but that's been a part of it as well.
I think we should try to talk them in at the Jung
So,
Institute in Zurich, having a bit of a blues festival there, a Jungian blues festival.
well, they actually do. I've done. Uh, they have a Friday evening at the end of each semester. They have a Friday evening, kind of what they call an apéro, a wine party,
Right.
and so often I'll do the music for that.
Oh, yeah,
Uh,
good.
yeah, so I always carry a guitar with me and a little amplifier, and yeah,
Mm, good.
yeah.
Well, Mark, this topic of Jung and the metaphoric mind, what got you into metaphor? How did that happen? What's it all about?
I guess the thing that started me down that path was a book by Ellen Seligman called Metaphor and Psychotherapy, or Ellen Siegelman, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And she wrote this entire book, I think around 1990, about metaphor in psychotherapy. So it's certainly not my original topic.
Mm,
Um, but she was a Jungian analyst and really shined a light on metaphorical processes in psychotherapy. And then what really triggered me was a research summary I saw on Shakespeare. And I found this article by this guy named Philip Davis at the University of Liverpool. And he's a Shakespearean scholar, and he wondered what is it that holds so much power in Shakespeare's words? Why do they still resonate with us so deeply? Is it just well-crafted words, or is there something else going on there? Is it just the universal themes that he touches on, jealousy and envy and uh, retaliation, revenge, all of these kind of base fundamental emotions? And so he went to his colleagues in the neuroscience department and said, is there any way we can study somebody's brain while they're reading Shakespeare? And so they said, sure, we can have them be in a functional magnet resonance imaging machine, an fMRI, while they're reading. And so they got subjects and they had the same subject read selections from ordinary prose, like you would read in a newspaper article or a magazine that's not intended to be uh, fictional or metaphorical at all. And
mm,
then also had them read passages from Shakespeare.
mm,
And Shakespeare uses a lot of metaphor, and he also uses a lot of grammatical oddities. He changes the use of words, and sometimes he takes verbs and turns them, or I'm trying to think of nouns and turns them into verbs and things like this,
mm,
and uses grammar in an odd way.
mm,
And so what they found was that when we're reading ordinary prose, we activate the left hemisphere primarily. And um, it's largely, so it's unicameral
mm,
and it's largely up in the frontal cortex and forward. Uh, which is where we do all of our conscious processing, all of our planning, where we store our grocery list, where we're planning out how do I get from A to B. All of that stuff takes place high up in the frontal cortex.
Yeah.
So that's what activated when we're reading ordinary prose. And then when the brain looks completely different, it doesn't just activate the right brain, it activates both hemispheres. It drops it back into the midbrain and down into the midbrain structures, the hypothalamus, for example, and the amygdala, where we do our most primitive emotional processing. And it lights the brain up into a much more active state. And as he puts it, he summarizes his findings and says metaphor is like rocket fuel for the brain.
Yeah.
Now, this happens whether somebody is intelligent, unintelligent, or of average intelligence. And it happens whether people are trying to respond to it or not trying. It's just an automatic response. And then a couple of guys, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, who write a lot about metaphor, and they are both philosophers and cognitive scientists. And they speak about metaphor as something so ubiquitous that we're all utilizing it without ever knowing it. So like when we use, and what they establish is that it's largely bodily based. So metaphor is the result of the pressure our body experience, our somatic experience, places on the mind to find words to express this experience. And so often metaphor is expressed, number one, in somatic terms. I feel like my head's going to explode. I feel like my neck is in a vice. Feels like there's a huge weight on my chest. I've got my back against the wall. We speak about I'm up today. It's up in relationship to the body, meaning my mood is high. I'm down today. My mood is low. So these are all somatic metaphors to express I'm green with envy. Again, it's a metaphorical process of expressing emotion.
I mean, what comes to mind is, I think, when Jung said that a neurosis is when one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing or whatever. That will stay, the way I see it, another way of saying what you just said is, that will stay with you. Whereas if you read a definition of neurosis, sometimes in the formal context or whatever, you might have to work a little bit harder to remember that one. But when there's those body metaphors, and the other thing I was thinking this morning, and I don't know who said this, maybe you've heard it, but someone said, metaphor is the language of the soul.
Yeah,
do you know who
I
said
don't
that?
know who I don't know who said that, but I would say it's accurate.
It kind of like, it seems to cut through and then speak to the soul, and there's the body images that come along with it, and if you hear maybe the right metaphor, or someone drops a metaphor which is good for you, you just have that, you can have that kind of aha moment, you can kind of see something that you haven't seen before.
Yeah, you can see, so a metaphor about not seeing is not seeing the forest for the trees. So there's so many trees that you don't distinguish between them, is the metaphor there. Yeah, metaphorical language grips us involuntarily, because we are optimized neurophysiologically, apparently, to respond to metaphor. Otherwise, you wouldn't get these kind of results from these experiments. Even there's other researchers that have followed up on this. And so the outer band around the edge of our cortex is called the somatosensory cortex. And that's where we process texture, for example. And so they did some studies to see what activates the somatosensory cortex. And so they gave, again, fMRI studies, two simple sentences. These are just one of many pairs of sentences. I had a bad day and I had a rough day. Now, very similar linguistic meaning, but I had a bad day does not activate the somatosensory cortex. I had a rough day, because rough infers texture, activates the somatosensory cortex. I mean, these kind of findings are fascinating to me. And I think very supportive of Jung's findings, of his emphasis on myth, fairy tale, mythology, alchemy, and religion.
Alchemy, yeah.
Yeah. And so for me, and what I've written about in a paper called Liber Novus and the Jung's Metaphorical Mind, is I make the argument that on some sense, in some levels, it doesn't really matter whether these myths, fairy tales, alchemy, and religious motifs are archetypal, because I know for certain that they're all metaphorical. Every myth, every fairy tale is a metaphor that stands in relationship to psychological interpersonal experiences. And that's why they're so powerful, and that's why they're so effective, such effective tools in analysis. But not just those four areas: art, poetry, literature, film,
music.
any of these things can be useful metaphors in a therapeutic process.
So Ian McGilchrist would be very happy with you, I believe, if he heard that.
Absolutely. Yes, I think he would indeed. Yeah.
Because as I remember, when he's talking about right brain, in the brain science of right brain function, there's a contextualization that happens
Yeah.
within the right brain.
Yeah. Right. And Alan Shore's work is very similar. In fact, McGilchrist probably cites Shore's work because McGilchrist isn't a researcher per se. He's a synthesizer of research and cultural studies, and he's making these links. But Alan Shore's really the guy who establishes. He's gone beyond. Spiri's work was the original right brain, left brain studies, and the problem was Spiri's subjects in his research were people that had severe epilepsy, and they had severed the corpus callosum, which are the thick neuronal connections between the hemispheres that allow the hemispheres to communicate with each other. And so when you sever the corpus callosum, it does appear that people are going to be exclusively left brain dominant or exclusively right brain dominant, but it doesn't quite work that way with normal subjects, where we actually still have an intact corpus callosum.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found is the most creative individuals, whether they're from art, from science, from mathematics, from physics, the most creative individuals are the individuals that activate both the right and left hemisphere. And Kant says something, well before this neuroscience. He says, thoughts without feeling, and of course, feelings are more right brain oriented contextualization stuff. Thoughts without feelings are dead.
Mm-hmm.
Feelings without thoughts are blind.
Mm-hmm.
And so we really need both hemispheres.
Bicameral people.
We need bicameral people. Exactly. To be our most effective, most creative selves, is we need that bicameral activation. And so it's a little bit, for me, it's a little bit problematic in the popular culture when people say, oh, I'm a left brain person or I'm a right brain person. And I'm thinking, no, you really want to be a bicameral person.
Yeah. I think Albert Einstein's perhaps a good example of someone where there seems to be that dynamism between left and right in the way that some things came to him in a dream or whatever, but he had the science there and they were working somehow together,
Yeah, and Kukla discovered the carbon ring in a dream, where he had a dream of a snake biting its tail, the Ouroboros symbol, and he wakes up and he says, oh, I understand the structure of carbon now. yeah, so I mean, this stuff happens all of the time, and there's many um, anecdotal stories of scientists, artists, musicians going for a nap, and then waking up with the solution to a problem.
Mm.
I've awakened from a nap with almost entire songs completely written, and all I had to do was jump up and write down the verses. And sure, there was a few little tweaks that I would put in, but 80-90% of the material was already there. And how do you explain that?
Well, we could explain that in a Jungian sense, in the
Right.
way that, well, it seems that if you start off somewhere in the creative process and
Mm-hmm.
you work on it,
Mm-hmm.
that sometimes it's just that with the passing of time, the sleep where there's that relaxation or whatever, that
Mm-hmm.
that work can just come into the conscious mind all of a sudden. But I see another very important point in all of this
Okay.
in terms of metaphor is that, like, that's what I was thinking this morning. I can look up the definition of individuation in a book, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the metaphors, the real metaphors, or the metaphors that kind of speak to me often come through dreams, often
Mm-hmm.
come through that nighttime activity. So it's catching those, which seems to be.
Mm-hmm.
So if I go back through those dreams that have made a big impact,
Mm-hmm.
there are the metaphors of individuation, if you want to put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, they're littered with metaphor if we're listening in the right way. Uh,
Mm.
if and I think it's in some ways it's not that I want to discard the idea of archetype, because I think there all are universal patterns that kind of structure both how we feel, how we perceive, how we experience. But as a therapist or an analyst, I think if we listened less for what's the archetypal pattern and more for what's the metaphor, we would think in a much more fluid way. And we would have that we would say we would hear our patients' metaphors in a different way. We would be more alert for them and see value in them, digest them, and give them back to the patient. And we would also speak more consistently in metaphorical terms. Like one patient was that I published the account in my book on interpretation in Jungian analysis, and she's speaking to me about an upcoming holiday in which she's going to have both sets of her grandchildren there, and they have two somewhat different rules at their households. And she's wondering, in a bit of an anxiety, she's a very responsible woman, and has a bit of anxiety about how she's going to manage these two sets of rules in terms of the access to the TV while her grandchildren are there. And I say in rather prose-like terms, "Oh, is that really your responsibility?" And she says, "No, I guess not. That's a relief." But her affect doesn't shift at all.
Mm.
Now, while we'd been talking, I'd been thinking about this movie by M. Night Shyamalan called The Village, in which it's this quaint, idyllic sort of village that looks like it's from the 1800s, Amish country or something. And they have kind of a barrier around the village, and the villagers are told that they shouldn't go out of the outer barrier because there's monsters in the woods and they will be attacked. Well, it turns out that this isn't a village from the 1800s at all. It's a contemporary village where people have retreated. The elders of the village retreated to escape traumas, griefs, etc., in their lives. And then they had their offspring, and their offspring had offspring. And so the only ones who knew the origin of the village were these elders. And they created this story to keep all of them close to the village and not venture out. And then miles away, there was an outer perimeter wall that they hired a security firm to patrol. Anyway, I'm thinking about this movie and all of the defenses, that were utilized to frighten people to stay the same. And I said to her, you've been up in the watchtower for a long time, scanning the horizon for problems to address. Perhaps it's time to ask yourself if it's safe to come out of the watchtower. So I didn't tell her about the movie, but I used this image of the watchtower that I got from the movie in my reverie. She immediately bursts into sobs and finally collects herself and says, I want to.
Yeah.
Well, it was.
I mean, it goes back to what you were saying about Shakespeare earlier or something, but the right kind of metaphor just cuts through to something primordial or
primordial and primarily affective and hits them in the body. Yeah. So I think that's
well, just but on another matter, Mark, what's your problem with archetype? I mean, where are you coming from with that? In the sense that I might say they're brother and sister, or they're closely related archetype and metaphor, or something.
I think it's not so much with the theory itself, but how the theory is taken up and practiced in a lot of circles. And the problem is, once we start thinking we know what to look for, we've kind of closed off possibilities.
It's preemptive. So there is a
tendency. Yeah, it's preemptive. It forecloses. So, people will start searching for, what archetype is this? And they're looking for a particular kind of data rather than having a very open catch for any kind of. And so I don't think that's so much the problem with Jung as how Jung is often utilized. And so you see in social media, here are the 12 archetypes, and which one are you? And I think that's just a reduction of that into a known thing, where Jung always said these are unknown things. We never experience the archetype directly. We can only experience an archetypal image that's not the archetype. It stands in for the archetype. It becomes part of the archetypal record, but it's not the archetype. So the archetype of the hero has, as Joseph Campbell pointed out, hero with 1,000 faces.
Or I understand what you're saying. It's almost like if you start talking about metaphor, it brings more kind of open space, because in the jargonized world of social media, we could say, he's operating out of the negative Xanax now. We're kind of
right
as part-time psychologists. So it's jumping in where what we really want to do, this is what it seems to me you're saying, what we really want to do is listen to the metaphor or listen to what's emerging.
Yeah, I think very much that we should be like jazz musicians. And, every jazz song starts out with what they call a head, which is just playing the simple melody of a known standard. Like John Coltrane used to play My Favorite Things from The Sound of Music, which is kind of a sappy pop song in a sense of the day. And so he plays it straight, as they call it, adding no embellishments. And then he takes 25 courses over 8 minutes in the recorded version of it, and then returns to the head. And so, but the other musicians are also playing with him, and they're listening to him, and they're taking some element that he plays, and then they're elaborating on that. And so it's this emergent, shared, co-creating process.
Yeah.
And I think when analysis is going well, that's what we're doing. Is we're in this emergent, co-created process where we're really riffing off of each other, rather than me guiding the patient down a particular path.
Depending on your theoretical bias. But having said that, I do remember something from Jung when he said, know the theories and then kind of let them go.
Right.
to a
Right.
degree. So it's not don't know the theory, but it's
Right.
let go of the theory to co-create within
Right.
therapeutic situation.
Right.
Mm.
Exactly. And Coltrane said something very similar. He said, first, learn your instrument, then learn the chords and the scales, then learn the standard repertoire, and then forget all of that shit and just play.
Yeah, that's good.
But he's saying there's a foundation there.
Mm.
And yeah, Jung said theories are the very devil. But of course, he's inventing theories. But he didn't want us to treat these theories as truths. He wanted us to treat them as hypotheses that are useful
So
to generate other ideas.
what does literalism mean? I mean, because someone who I like, James Hillman, literalism is the very devil to James Hillman.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so it seems to be kind of on the other end of the spectrum, kind
Mm-hmm.
of to metaphor. What is it?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's where we reduce everything to the most basic appearance. So literalism, or we refer to it as concretism. Somebody who doesn't have a symbolic capacity. They can't relate to things metaphorically, at least in their conscious minds. As we've said, everybody relates to it, but they may not get it. So somebody dreams about a red car, and you ask them for their associations, and they said, "Oh, I had a red car in high school," or "I've always wanted a red car," or "Yeah, I saw a red car yesterday." That's literalism or concretism. They can't think beyond that. Oh, what else might a car be? A car might represent our capacity for getting around in the world. A car is a very powerful thing with these cars that have 200, 300, 400 horsepower. The car might be aspirational. The car might be the thing that prevented them not having a car, might be the thing that prevented them from advancing in life. There's all sorts of things a car might be. It might be that their father was an auto mechanic and the car actually represents something of the father complex. So there can be all sorts of different meanings of a car
Mm,
if we can help the patient develop a more fluid, flexible relationship to it.
mm,
And so sometimes that's part of analysis, is just cultivating the patient's symbolic capacity and moving them from a concrete or literal perspective into a symbolic perspective. And largely for me, that's often done through metaphor, by speaking in metaphor. And sometimes they'll say, well, what do you mean? And then if I unpack the metaphor for them a little bit, they kind of get the nuts and bolts of the metaphor, and they
mm,
begin to see in metaphor themselves.
mm. Cultivating a love of metaphor. And
Mm-hmm.
it struck me when you were speaking there that materialism has really added to the concreteness, hasn't it? It's kind of like, well, there was the rational enlightenment, and then we've got this kind of what is it? The straight upward path towards material success. It's kind of like it's somehow uh, put metaphorical things as a luxurious, unneeded,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps, kind of thing in our life.
Right. I mean, that's kind of seems to be what, the capitalism as a structure in society has kind of led us towards. And, there's, particularly around the idea of AI, of distributed mind, things like this, that there's obviously benefits to those things, artificial intelligence and the distributed mind. It's fascinating and exciting that we can search instantly, hundreds of thousands of books. But there are neurological changes that are occurring for everyone. The researchers on brain development now say that almost everyone is becoming much more attention deficit like in their attention span. We have much more difficulty attending for long periods of time because we're on screens a lot of time, and we're having all of these images pop in, pop-up ads. We can easily click from screen to screen. We'll see something in a story and we'll click on that link, and then we're into another story, and we have much more difficulty, and we can now study that, and that people in general are having much more difficulty reading and understanding long form text, anything that's beyond a page or two. So that's one effect, that we no longer have the tendency in school to store information long term, because we know we can go look it up somewhere. So we remember where to look it up, but we don't remember the material itself. And that creates differences in how we work with information. We work with information that's internalized through memory differently and have it available to us differently than when we're relying on this distributed memory, the Google mind, as some people call it. And so there are some real negative effects in terms of some things that we value that are non-material, that are really getting eroded by this very materialistic environment that we live in.
And as you were talking, I was thinking of alchemy in terms of some of the metaphors it sometimes provides, but working the material, it's kind of like, I think it's an old example, but the kind of fast food fix of the memes and the fed images or whatever. But this other thing of actually working with the materials, of digesting the materials, of it's kind of like, that's what seems so kind of necessary, which we could also say is working with the metaphors.
Yeah. I mean, there's tons of alchemical metaphors that are useful to us. We don't emphasize them as much, even though they're in the text. But Jung opens one of his passages on alchemy and individuation of really speaking about the emphasis on attention and patience of the alchemist and the sor mystica, or the alchemist and their apprentice, and how important it is to maintain observation on the materials and not to fall asleep or look away. And so there's this real emphasis on close attention over time and noticing how the materials that are being acted on by the distilling vessel or by the heat in the oven are being affected. And I think that's really a wonderful metaphor for both the individuation process and the analytic process.
It gives different metaphors. It starts talking about heat and temperature and the mixing of substances, and it leads down another fruitful path.
Right, and it gives us, again, metaphors to think about things in metaphorical terms. Can we get at it somewhere else? The idea of sublimatio, of going up, of spiritualizing things. Yeah, we can find other language for that. We can find other metaphorical systems for that. But alchemy provides a really rich system of metaphors. It's not the only one or the most absolutely essential one, but it is one, kind of like the metaphors of Greek mythology, things like that, Norse mythology, Asian mythologies. Each of them has their own strengths and benefits. For Jung, alchemy really spoke to this ongoing process of individuation, of going through all of these phases and transformations and ending up with this, what is referred to in alchemy as the philosopher's stone, the ultimate goal, the ultimate manifestation of this process, or of the turning of the lead into gold. And so there is this outcome that's depicted, even though we know nobody really achieves and says, "Oh, I'm individuated now, and I know I'm individuated." It's always an ongoing.
Well, if they do say that, start running quickly.
Right,
I would
right.
suggest.
Then they've probably become a guru, and they've probably building up a cult around them.
Mark, and one thing I wanted to, because I know, maybe we are getting towards time, but I like also the way you kind of embrace the popular culture, right? So we've spoken about it already in terms of music and all of that, but why Why do you go down that path? Why aren't you kind of, you know, staying
Well,
in?
most of the people that Jung and early Jungians were seeing as patients,
Hmm.
they grew up in an educational system in which they studied ancient Greek, ancient Latin. Um, they studied classical mythology and fairy tales in school. These were common topics for the everyday person, not the elite that go to Ivy League schools or uh, things like that. These are the commonplace things, ordinary subjects that every student that went to school for a period of time studied, and so they were easily available.
Hmm.
And the majority of people nowadays don't read ancient Greek and Latin in school. They don't study classics as von Franz did. Uh, and so they don't have, so these archetypal metaphors of myth, fairy tale, religion, and alchemy are not available to the patient. And so
Hmm.
sometimes we can actually create a distance and we can intellectualize by introducing these things. It's not that I never do introduce them, I do introduce them with some patients, but film, literature, if it's a novel, I really love a novelist named Cormac McCarthy.
Hmm.
And even if they haven't read them and they've only heard the name, for example, it's a little bit more familiar. They're a
Yeah.
little bit less suspicious of it. They're a little bit more open to it. And so I will amplify situations with movies, for example, which are perhaps the most accessible form of, you could say, archetypal patterns. Because even Joseph Campbell, or not Joseph Campbell, but in the what was it? The Power of Myth. Yeah, Joseph Campbell is talking about that Star Wars is just contemporary mythology. He says all of the themes are there: good and evil, dark and light, at war with each other. Those are mythological themes. So what does it matter if it's uh, the War of the Gods in Norse mythology or Star Wars? If it's the same material being played out, does it matter where it comes from as long as these fundamental universal human experiences are portrayed?
Hmm. Yeah.
So there's a group called Theaters of War that go around, and they do use ancient Greek stories from not just myths but Greek history, you know, the Peloponnesian Wars and things. And they'll have a group of actors come into a military base and read these texts to soldiers and family members of soldiers, and it's very powerful to them to hear these stories that were told thousands of years ago and see that, oh, they're talking about PTSD. They're just not using that word. They're talking about the family being left in uncertainty back at home, wondering if their loved one is still alive. These are universal themes that echo across the ages.
That
But
play out, or as Campbell said, Beauty and the Beast is playing out on 42nd Street in New York
exactly.
as we speak, or whatever.
Right. And so, whether we're going to ancient sources or contemporary sources, I think we're still speaking about these same universal aspects of human existence. And I find that the more contemporary ones are, my patients are more receptive to it and respond in a more powerful way to it. Like my patient, who, even though I'm not mentioning a movie, I'm drawing from a movie in what I say to her about coming out of the watchtower.
Mm. The themes show up in different ways. And on that matter, I would like to draw the connection between Bob Dylan and Shakespeare, drawing
Uh-huh.
on what you're saying, because whilst it's putting in very high uh, company,
Right.
he also, with his stream of images, the sky
Mm-hmm.
cracked its poems and the wild cathedrals in the sky and all of
Yeah.
that was erupting in the 60s. But his unusual oddity of metaphor
Right.
is
And
to
then
me somehow a little he's Shakespeare's little brother or something in the modern version.
exactly. And he doesn't insist on creating rational uh, thought lines in his songs. What you're describing, and you could say, well, that's an influence of psychedelia. That's an influence of the times of the drugs, the psychedelics that were being used at the time. Or you could say Dylan writes songs in a more dreamlike quality where rationality is suspended, which is
Mm.
why dreams are so powerful because they don't have to be consistent with conscious waking life. And often that's where they're most powerful. And what the patient responds to the most is when they're doing something or something happens that couldn't happen in waking life,
Mm.
where they can fly in waking life. It allows us to take up topics and subjects and situations that would be impossible to recreate in waking life, but then it allows us to reflect on what implications that has for the patient and how they digest their own experience.
Yeah. And just going back to Alan Shaw for 1 second, I remember he said with mothers and babies that there's a right brain to right brain communication kind of thing. And as you were talking then, I was thinking like, with Bob Dylan, it's like there can be a right brain to right brain communication that goes on there.
Mm-hmm.
That uh, because if that's an incredibly important thing between a mother and a
Mm-hmm.
baby, it's also something that's happening in the wider.
Right. And Jung emphasized that there's a diagram that he has in his essay, The Psychology of Transference, in which he draws four corners of a rectangle, and then he has diagonal lines across the middle. And the upper corners are the consciousness of the analyst and the consciousness of the patient. And then the bottom corners are the unconscious components. And so he's diagramming all of the possible conscious to unconscious and unconscious to unconscious communication that's going on.
Right.
And so that's part of what you're talking about is this kind of reverie state, this right brain consciousness that's going on between mother and infant, particularly during nursing, for example, in
Mm.
which they're both entering a shared state of mind, somewhat colored differently based on who's the giver and who's the receiver, but they form a unit of consciousness in that moment. Uh,
Mm.
or actually a unit of uh, shared psyche, you could say.
Yeah, shared cycle. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or co-creation was the term you used early on in this
Right.
conversation.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind
Right.
of that happening as well.
Right.
Co-regulation.
Right. And as Winnicott aptly put it, there is no infant without a mother and no mother without an infant,
Mm.
which is a beautiful way of expressing that dyadic interaction in which momentarily the two become one. Or during sexual experiences, you
Mm.
know, two people become one
Mm.
for a period of time.
It's what's happening through music a lot as well. And I have got maybe one last question for you, Mark, is
Okay.
why is it that when you listen to blues music, oh, well, I want to tell a joke about country and western music first. The guy said,
Okay.
what happens is if you play the song backwards, you get your girlfriend and your truck and your dog back if you play country music back.
Right.
But why is it that I'm listening to BB King sing "The Thrill Is Gone"
Mm-hmm.
and it's ostensibly a very sad song about loss,
Mm-hmm.
the end of a relationship,
Mm-hmm.
the thrill having gone out of a relationship. But why does it
Right.
somehow make you feel happy or connected?
Well,
Or
I don't think it makes us feel happy per se, but it allows us to feel connected to each other. And so when BB King's singing about it, in some way, we're empathically identifying with his situation that he's singing about, resonating with it, and remembering either experiences of our own like that, or imagining ourselves. We don't even have to experience it. We know through mirror neurons now there is an actual mechanism about how we empathize and connect with people on a nonverbal, somatic, physical level. And songs like this are part of what allows us to do that, is that the listener is hearing, identifying, and imagining themselves in a similar situation. And then all of it is the note choices that evoke a particular feeling. They're often discordant in comparison to other forms of pop music, for example, or Western classical music, much of it. And then there's a rhythmic beat that I write about in this. The beat goes on, book chapter in a book on blues and theology, and that we actually somatically, the term is entrain. In other words, we get synchronized our bodies between that and the beat. And so we start tapping our foot or rocking our shoulders or bobbing our heads in time with the music that the musicians are creating. And so we get a shared rhythmic entrainment with that. And along with that is what's called affective synchrony. We begin to feel the similar feelings that are expressed in the music. So there's two types of synchronization that are going on, both rhythmically and affectively. And it's really a powerful thing. And I'm writing about that both in terms of the experience of blues music, but also the experience of music in the church, and
Yeah.
particularly the black church.
It's communitas too, isn't it? Using that word, it's uh, one could say it's that experience of the human community at its deepest.
Yeah,
When there's that synchronism, as you're talking about.
right, right. So if people are in a room together and they're dancing, they're not just dancing by themselves, they're dancing in community, even if it's a short-lived community.
Mm,
We may not ever speak to somebody that we were dancing next to in a small club again. And yet,
mm,
in that moment, we are members of a tribe in that club,
mm.
all sharing in this communal dance.
But if I had just started Jungian psychology, I might say, oh, that sounds a bit like participation mystique to me. That's very bad. You're not meant to.
Right, and that was the focus of my second book, Shared Realities: Participation, Mystique, and Beyond. And in that book, all of the authors tried to agreed that participation mystique, in the way Jung writes about it comes off sounding bad, primitive, undeveloped. Uh, but as Eric Neumann wrote about, he chose to term it unitary reality, and that it was a way of sharing a field of experience rather than operating at a lower level of consciousness.
Mm,
And so, yeah, we try to highlight the positive. There are positive elements of participation mystique that get overlooked, and that's what that book was about. Was trying to highlight the positive aspects of participation mystique, and that it's an essential part. So
mm,
anytime you go to a football game or a soccer game,
mm,
and you see all these people wearing the same jersey as their
mm.
favorite team, and they're getting chants going. That's a participation mystique. It allows us to feel like we belong to something, and belonging to something is becoming
Incredibly important.
incredibly important.
And the need for those experiences, and also that perhaps sometimes we think that, oh, the mob or the tribe, we can be swept away,
Hmm.
and there's some truth in that. There's no doubt about
Right,
it. A mob or a tribe, a group think, and all of that. But the other side of it is the human community or whatever.
right, absolutely, yeah. And we need community.
Mm,
And there's very, very few of us that don't need community. Sure, there's a few people that prefer to live a life of isolation, whether it's a traditional life of being a hermit in a religious community, or whether it's being an isolationist who's withdrawn somewhat, but that's usually due to disruptions in the ability to form relationships. So there's something going on there that prevents them from feeling a part of a community, and they choose to reduce their painfulness around that by separating themselves even further from the community that they don't know how to fit in with. But this is one of the contemporary research is this emphasis on loneliness as one of the most epidemic contributors to decline in health in later years in our contemporary society. That I forget what the statistics were, but I read it recently that something like 80% of people who are above 70, no, it's not that high, but like 1 in 3 people who are over 70 have one or less contact with another person each week. Well, that's tragic. But because of the changes in our society, the changes in our patterns of living, changes in how careers play out, we were a much more geographically dispersed group. Many of the things, that happened during COVID, where people couldn't go out. And a lot of those changes have maintained. People are going out for dinner at a much lower level. They're going out to see live entertainment at a lower level. Joining of groups, just social interest groups, is on decline. We are becoming an increasingly socially isolated society, and it's got terrible effects on our health, both mentally and physically.
And by the way, when those tariffs kick in over there, that's going to be even more so, because a Big Mac is going to cost $35 or something like that. So,
right, and with all of the prohibitions that are getting placed on travel to the United States, the United States is going to become an increasingly isolated country, and we're going to have less and less visitors from other places, and that's a problem too.
not on the Jung and the World podcast though, because
not
there'll still be connection.
That's great. Yes,
that's great. All of that, Mark, and thank you very much for.
You're welcome, John, and thank you for inviting me onto the show. And look forward to seeing it online.
Thank you.